The $90 million view from the penthouse suite of the St. Jude Medical Tower offered a panorama of the city, a sprawling circuit board of light and life that felt a universe away. Inside, however, in the climate-controlled silence, Chairman Kwon Jae-sung was dying. He knew it with the kind of primal certainty that no amount of money could soothe. The illness was a ghost, a creeping paralysis that stole sensation from his limbs and clarity from his mind. It had no name, no precedent, and it seemed no cure. His physicians, the esteemed Dr. Alastair Finch and his brilliant subordinate Dr. Evelyn Reed, spoke in hushed, confident tones of experimental cellular rejuvenation therapies and groundbreaking proteomic analysis. They presented charts with reassuring upward curves that contradicted the leaden reality in his own veins. The $100 million research fund he had established was supposed to be his salvation, a brute force assault of wealth against biology. Yet with every sterile, precisely administered drip, with every meticulously planned meal, he felt himself receding, the world blurring at the edges. The paradox was a razor in his mind. The most expensive, advanced medical care in the world was yielding nothing but a slow, inexorable decline. He was a king trapped in a tower of his own making, his authority useless against the quiet treason of his own body. Into this sterile, high-stakes theater of managed decay stepped Chloe Washington, 18 years old, a ghost of a different sort. Her uniform was a pale blue dress, her presence muted by a white apron and the rhythmic, unobtrusive swish of her mop against the polished marble floor. She was part of the suite's architecture, a silent functionary as easily ignored as the air filtration system. But Chloe saw things. Her mind, uncluttered by ambition or expectation, was a pristine vessel for detail. She saw the microscopic film of dust that the day shift missed on the window ledge. She saw the faint, almost imperceptible tremor in Dr. Reed's hand as she adjusted Mr. Kwon's saline drip. And she saw the plant. It was a magnificent Kentia palm, chosen for its supposed air-purifying qualities, its fronds a deep, glossy green. Or they had been. Now, the tips of the lowest fronds were browning, a brittle, desiccated decay that was creeping slowly upward. It was a tiny, insignificant detail, a botanical footnote in a room dedicated to saving a human life. But Chloe, polishing the base of the ceramic pot, noticed it was wilting in a way that defied the room's perfect light and measured hydration. It was wilting as if from the inside out. The browning of the palm frond was a dissonant note in the otherwise perfect symphony of care. Dr. Finch, a man whose silver hair and Seville rose suits seemed part of his medical credentials, would often gesture towards the lush greenery as a metaphor for their work. "Life persists, Chairman. We need only provide the right environment," he'd say, his voice a smooth balm of professional certainty. Chloe heard him say it once while she was emptying the waste bin, and the words felt hollow. The plant was dying. It was a small, inconvenient truth in a room built on a foundation of expensive hope. Chloe watched as a specialist from a high-end nursery came once a week. He would check the soil moisture, mist the leaves, and prune the dying tips with sterile shears, his expression a mask of polite confusion. "It must be the air," he'd murmur to one of Mr. Kwon's impassive bodyguards. "Too filtered, perhaps. Lacks vitality," but Chloe knew it wasn't the air. She had cared for her grandmother's collection of houseplants in their small, stuffy apartment, and she knew the language of leaves. This wasn't a failure to thrive. It was a poisoning. The decay was too uniform, too systematic. It was a mirror, she realized with a cold knot in her stomach, to the man in the bed. Mr. Kwon's own decline was just as methodical. It wasn't a chaotic collapse, but a structured dismantling. First the numbness in his feet, then the loss of fine motor control in his hands, now the fog that clouded his thoughts. He looked at the doctors, his eyes sharp with a frustration he could no longer properly articulate, while they spoke of progress. "The peripheral neuropathy is a temporary side effect of the treatment protocol," Dr. Reed explained, her gaze never quite meeting his. "It indicates the agents are working." Chloe, cleaning the baseboards nearby, saw the lie not of her words, but in the subtle tension of her jaw. She saw the way Dr. Finch placed a reassuring hand on Mr. Kwon's shoulder, a gesture of dominance, disguised as comfort. They were too calm, their confidence too polished. They were dismissing the patient's reality in favor of their own narrative, and the dying plant was the one silent witness that agreed with what she was seeing. The image of the wilting palm dredged up a memory Chloe kept locked away in the most guarded part of her mind. It was a memory of another plant, a cluster of nightshade berries her younger brother, Samuel, had found fascinating. He was 7. She was 12. He had sketched them in his little notebook, marveling at their deep, glossy purple. He hadn't eaten them, of course, but he'd handled them, his small fingers crushing a few. Later that week, he developed a rash, then a fever, then a terrifying lethargy that the doctors at the county clinic dismissed as a stubborn flu. They'd sent him home with instructions for hydration and rest. Chloe remembered her own frantic, childish research in the library, trying to connect the berries to his symptoms. She had found a passage in an old botany text about tropane alkaloids, about how even skin contact with certain plants could cause neurological symptoms in sensitive individuals. She had tried to tell the doctor, a tired, overworked man who had patted her on the head and told her not to worry. Samuel had died 2 days later from respiratory failure, his official cause of death an unspecified viral infection. The autopsy, which their family couldn't afford to contest, was inconclusive. The medical bills from his brief illness had shattered their already fragile finances, forcing Chloe to abandon her dreams of a scholarship, of a life in a lab coat. It forced her into a light blue dress and a white apron. The guilt was a physical weight she carried every day. It wasn't just grief. It was the sting of being dismissed, of knowing a crucial detail and having no one listen. Her dormant expertise wasn't formal. It was the scar tissue of trauma. She had an almost painful sensitivity to patterns of decay, a hypervigilance honed by loss. She saw the same pattern now in Mr. Kwan's suite, a creeping, systematic poisoning, and a chorus of confident, dismissive voices insisting it was something else entirely. The wilting palm wasn't just a plant. It was a ghost of her brother's unanswered questions. And this time, she refused to be silent. The risk was enormous. She was a cleaner, invisible, but the cost of inaction felt infinitely greater. Her invisibility became her greatest asset. Chloe's work gave her access to the intimate refuse of Mr. Kwan's treatment. She moved through the suite like a phantom, her presence so routine that she was no longer perceived. She began her methodical investigation under the guise of meticulous cleaning. Her attention to detail, once a simple source of pride in her work, was now a surgical tool. She started with the 4 bags. Each day, a new one was hung, the saline solution clear and innocuous. But she noted the lot numbers on the labels, photographing them discreetly with the cheap phone she kept in her apron pocket. She paid attention to the disposal. Dr. Reed always administered the final injection into the foreport herself, using a small, unlabeled glass vial. She would then discard the vial and syringe into the red biohazard sharps container. Standard procedure. But Chloe observed that Dr. Reed always lingered for a moment, ensuring the container was securely locked, her movements just a fraction too deliberate. It was the food, however, that offered the next clue. Mr. Kwan's meals were prepared by a Michelin-starred chef, but the final plating was done in a small kitchenette attached to the suite, always supervised by Dr. Finch or Dr. Reed. Chloe, while cleaning the kitchenette late one night, noticed a faint, almost imperceptible residue at the bottom of the small ceramic bowl used for sauces. It had a slightly bitter, astringent smell, like crushed stems. She carefully scraped a tiny sample of the dried residue onto a piece of clean cloth from her cart and folded it into her pocket. The most significant discovery came from the trash. While emptying the bins from the small office where the doctors conferred, she found a discarded printout in the shredder bin that had failed to engage. It was a complex chemical diagram, a molecular structure she didn't recognize, but whose ring-like formation reminded her of the alkaloids she had studied obsessively after Samuel's death. At the bottom was a handwritten note. Increased dosage by 5 micrograms. Neuropathy is progressing slower than projected. The cold, clinical language sent a chill through her. This wasn't a treatment. It was a calibration. She was no longer just suspicious. She was certain. She was standing in the middle of a slow, meticulously planned murder, and the murderers were the very men and women lauded as saviors. The chemical diagram was the key, but it was a key to a lock she couldn't open. She needed someone who could read its language, someone who would believe an 18-year-old cleaner over two of the most respected physicians in the country. The name that surfaced from her past was Dr. Marcus Cole. He had been her botany and organic chemistry professor at the community college, a kind, rumpled man who had seen a spark in her that went beyond textbook memorization. He had encouraged her, lent her advanced reading materials, and expressed genuine disappointment when she'd been forced to drop out. She remembered his office, a chaotic jungle of potted ferns and stacked journals, a place that had felt more like home than her own apartment. Reaching out to him was a terrifying step. It meant crossing a line from passive observation to active intervention. It meant risking her job, her anonymity, and the quiet, fragile stability she had built for her family. She found his university email address online and wrote a short, carefully worded message, asking for a brief meeting to discuss a botanical query. He replied within the hour, his tone warm and welcoming. They met at a small coffee shop near the university campus, far from the sterile opulence of St. Jude's. Chloe felt out of place, her simple uniform hidden under a worn coat. She laid out her evidence on the small table between them, the photograph of the chemical structure, the cloth with the residue sample, and a small, brittle piece of the Kenya palm frond she had carefully collected. She spoke in a low, steady voice, presenting her observations without emotion or hyperbole. She told him about the plant, the IVs, the doctor's behavior, and the chilling note. She watched his face shift from polite interest to skepticism, then to deep, furrowed concern. He picked up the photo of the diagram. This is a complex alkaloid, Chloe. Highly complex. It's not something you'd find in a standard toxicology screen. He looked at her, his gaze sharp. Where did you say you found this? Chloe explained, and then, for the first time, she told him about her brother, Samuel. The story came out in a quiet, halting rush, the grief still raw beneath the surface. That was when the last trace of doubt left his eyes. He remembered the fierce, intelligent girl from his classroom. He remembered the raw potential. He put the evidence into his briefcase. I have access to a mass spectrometer in the university lab, he said, his voice now grim. It's not certified for medical evidence, but it will tell us what this is. Let me see what I can find. The preliminary results from Dr. Cole came 2 days later in a one-line text message. We need to talk. Now. They met again, this time in his lab after hours. The air smelled of ethanol and soil. The results were displayed on a monitor, a series of peaks and valleys that meant nothing to a layperson but were a confession to a chemist. It's a synthetic derivative of Colchicum autumnale, Dr. Cole said, pointing to a specific peak on the graph. The autumn crocus. It's a potent phytotoxin. In small, repeated doses, it mimics the symptoms of degenerative nerve diseases like ALS. It causes systemic organ failure over a period of months. It's incredibly difficult to detect because the body metabolizes it quickly, leaving behind markers that look like natural cellular decay. He ran the sample from the palm frond. The results were the same. They're poisoning the plant with the same substance, probably through the water. It's a control. A way to visually monitor the toxin's efficacy and decay rate in a living organism. It's diabolical. And brilliant, the cold certainty of it settled in Chloe's stomach. They had the proof, but they were powerless. Official channels were impossible. Who would believe them? It would be their word against two medical titans, their evidence dismissed as circumstantial or fabricated. We can't go to the hospital board or the police, Chloe stated, her voice barely a whisper. They'll bury it. They'll destroy us, Dr. Cole nodded, his face grim. They'd paint you as a disgruntled, disturbed young woman. And I'd be a discredited academic. There was only one path forward, one that required a leap of faith into the lion's den. I have to tell him, Chloe said, the words tasting like fear and resolve. I have to tell Mr. Kwan it was a desperate, almost suicidal plan. She had to convince a man who trusted no one to trust the one person everyone overlooked. She waited for her moment. It came late one evening, after the doctors had left and his sole bodyguard had stepped out for a moment. Mr. Kwan was awake, his gaze fixed on the city lights, his face a mask of weary resignation. Chloe stepped forward from the shadows, her heart hammering against her ribs. Chairman Kwan, she began, her voice quiet but clear. My name is Chloe. I'm a cleaner. We need to talk about your treatment. His eyes, clouded with fatigue, sharpened with a flicker of surprise and annoyance. But he didn't call for security. He simply watched her and waited. Mr. Kwan's silence was more intimidating than any outburst. He was a man accustomed to filtering information, to assessing threats and opportunities in the spaces between words. Chloe stood before him, a slight figure in a pale blue dress, and methodically laid out her case. She did not speak of murder or conspiracy. She used the language of observation, of data. "I have noticed a correlation," she began, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "It is between the administration of a specific compound in Tier 4 and an acceleration in the browning of the Kenya palm in your room. The rate of cellular decay in the plant appears to mirror the progression of your neuropathy." She presented him with a small, hand-drawn chart, a simple graph plotting the weekly pruning of the palm against his own reported symptoms, which she had gleaned from overheard conversations between the doctors. It was crude, but the correlation was undeniable. She then showed him the photograph of the chemical diagram. "My former professor, a botanist at the university, identified this as a synthetic phytotoxin, a plant-based poison. He believes it is being introduced into your saline solution." She placed the phone on his bedside table, the image glowing in the dim light. She did not mention Dr. Finch or Dr. Reed by name. She did not have to. The implication was absolute, a foundational betrayal that hung in the air between them. Mr. Kwan listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. His world was one of loyalty and betrayal, of calculated risks. He was being asked to believe an invisible girl over the two men to whom he had entrusted his life and a fortune. He felt the familiar cognitive dissonance welling up, the feeling of getting worse while being told he was getting better. Chloe's words were a key, unlocking a suspicion he hadn't allowed himself to fully form. "Why?" he finally asked, his voice a dry rasp. "Why would you do this? What do you want?" Chloe met his gaze directly. "My brother died because someone with authority didn't listen to a small detail," she said softly. "I won't let that happen again. I don't want anything." That was the statement that broke through his defenses. In his world, everyone wanted something. Her lack of an angle was the most convincing evidence of all. He looked from her earnest face to the dying plant in the corner, and for the first time in months, he saw a path through the fog. He made his decision. "Leave this with me," he commanded, gesturing to the phone. "And say nothing." The next morning, the suite's routine continued with flawless precision. Dr. Finch and Dr. Reed made their rounds, their voices a symphony of professional concern. They noted Mr. Kwan's increased lethargy with practiced sympathy, assuring him it was a sign the therapy was entering a new, more aggressive phase. They did not notice the change in their patient's eyes, the new stillness, the quiet, analytical coldness that had replaced his weary resignation. They did not see him palm a small, sophisticated recording device disguised as a cufflink. While Dr. Reed prepared the daily for, Mr. Kwan engaged Dr. Finch in a seemingly rambling conversation about financial markets, a deliberate distraction. As soon as they left, he made a single call. His voice was weak, but the authority within it was undiminished. He spoke in rapid, coded Korean to his most trusted subordinate, a man who operated entirely outside the legitimate structures of his business empire. The instructions were simple and precise. A sample was to be collected from the Active 4 bag, bypassing hospital security entirely. A second team was to acquire the financials of Drs. Finch and Reed for the last 5 years, every account, every transaction, every shell corporation. A third was to establish a private, mobile lab, staffed by a forensic toxicologist from Seoul who owed Kwan his life. The entire operation was to be silent, leaving no trace. For 2 days, Mr. Kwan played the part of the declining patient. He endured the treatments, the condescending reassurances, the slow poisoning of his own body. It was an act of supreme self-control, a strategic endurance he had learned long ago in the brutal boardrooms and back alleys of Seoul. He watched Chloe as she performed her duties, their eyes meeting only once in a brief, silent acknowledgement. He saw not a cleaner, but an analyst, a quiet warrior who had armed him for the most important battle of his life. The information began to flow back to him through encrypted channels. The financial reports came first, a web of offshore accounts, dummy corporations, and laundered payments, all originating from the research fund he had so generously established. The doctors had already siphoned off nearly $30 million. Then came the toxicology report. The results were unequivocal. The saline solution contained trace, but medically significant, amounts of a colchicine derivative, a substance perfectly matching the one Dr. Cole had identified. The betrayal was no longer a theory. It was a proven fact, laid bare in columns of figures and chemical signatures. Chairman Kwan closed his eyes. The time for observation was over. The time for reckoning had begun. Mr. Kwan orchestrated the confrontation with the precision of a military campaign. He requested a formal progress meeting in his suite, summoning not only Dr. Finch and Dr. Reed, but also the hospital's chief administrator, a man named Henderson whose primary skill was managing the institution's pristine reputation. The doctors arrived first, carrying iPads with glossy presentations, their faces arranged in expressions of solemn importance. Henderson followed, exuding a nervous affability. They found Chairman Kwan not in his bed, but sitting in a high-backed armchair, dressed in a silk robe. Beside him stood two men in dark, severe suits who were clearly not hospital staff. The atmosphere in the room was immediately tense, the air thick with unspoken questions. "Gentlemen," Mr. Kwan began, his voice surprisingly strong. "Thank you for coming. We are here to discuss a termination. Not of my treatment, but of your careers." Dr. Finch's professional smile faltered. "Chairman, I'm not sure I understand. Perhaps the medication is causing some confusion." Kwan raised a hand, silencing him. "There is no confusion." One of his men stepped forward and placed a thin file on the coffee table. He opened it. The first page was a bank statement from a Cayman Islands account in Dr. Finch's name. "This account," Kwan said calmly, "received a transfer of $7 million 2 days after you convinced me to double the funding for your proteomic research. Perhaps you can explain this groundbreaking result." Finch went pale. Dr. Reed stared at the document, her composure shattering like glass. "This is an outrageous invasion of privacy," Finch sputtered, his voice losing its smooth timbre. Henderson looked back and forth between them, his face a mask of horror. Kwan's man turned the page. It was the toxicology report from the independent lab, highlighting the colchicine derivative found in the 4-bag. "And this," Kwan continued, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet level, "is the cellular rejuvenation agent you have been administering. A poison, refined and calibrated to kill me slowly enough for you to drain my accounts dry." He gestured to the wilting palm in the corner. "You even kept a test subject in the room to measure your progress." The arrogance is breathtaking. He leaned forward, his eyes like chips of ice. "You did not see a patient. You saw Mark. But you forgot to ask what business I was in before I became a philanthropist. You forgot that I am better at recognizing predators than any man you will ever meet." The carefully constructed world of Dr. Alastair Finch and Dr. Evelyn Reed collapsed in the span of 10 minutes. Their denials were feeble, their blustering indignation quickly giving way to panicked, accusatory glances at one another. Henderson, the administrator, was a study in damage control, stammering about internal investigations and upholding the hospital's standards, but his words were meaningless noise in the face of Kwan's cold fury. The two men in suits were not policemen, but they were far more efficient. They escorted the two doctors from the room, their briefcases and professional dignity left behind. The subsequent fallout was handled with quiet, surgical precision. There was no public scandal, no sensational trial. Finch and Reed disappeared. The official story was that they had resigned to pursue private research opportunities abroad. But within the closed circles of high finance and medicine, the truth circulated in hushed whispers. The $30 million was returned to Kwan's accounts with an expediency that suggested extreme duress. The hospital, terrified of the consequences, purged its senior administration and offered Chairman Kwan a settlement of a magnitude that would never be made public. He began a new, legitimate treatment protocol, flying in a team of specialists from Korea. The detoxification was arduous, a slow, painful battle to reclaim his own body from the chemical siege it had endured. Throughout it all, he asked for Chloe. She would come to the room, not as a cleaner, but as a visitor. They rarely spoke. She would simply sit and read, her quiet, steady presence a balm against the pain of his recovery. One afternoon, as he was finally beginning to regain some feeling in his hands, he turned to her. "I owe you my life," he said, the words stripped of all artifice. "Name your price." "Anything." Chloe looked up from her book. She thought of her brother, of the future that had been stolen from him, from her. "I don't want money," she said. "I want to finish what I started. I want to go back to school." For Samuel, Kwan nodded slowly, a deep and profound understanding passing between them. It was not about a reward. It was about restoring a broken balance, about turning the pain of the past into the purpose of the future. He would establish a foundation in her brother's name, a scholarship that would fund not just her education, but the education of 100 others like her. Months bled into a year. The St. Jude Medical Tower became a distant memory for Chloe. She was no longer defined by a pale blue uniform, but by the worn backpack slung over her shoulder and the stack of textbooks in her arms. She was a student at the city's top university, enrolled in the biochemistry and toxicology program. The lecture halls were vast, the material challenging, but she felt a sense of belonging she hadn't realized she'd lost. The scholarship, named the Samuel Washington Grant for Observational Science, was her silent motivation. Every complex equation she solved, every lab report she perfected, was a quiet tribute to the brother whose own curiosity had been extinguished too soon. She was reclaiming her stolen future, not just for herself, but for him. She had found that the same skills that made her a good cleaner, patience, methodical observation, an eye for details others missed, made her an exceptional scientist. The grief for Samuel had not vanished, but it had transformed. The sharp edges of guilt had been smoothed into a quiet, powerful resolve. She had not been able to save him, but she had saved another, and in doing so, had saved herself from a life of invisible regret. One afternoon, a courier delivered a small, square box to her dormitory. Inside, nestled in a bed of silk, was a single, perfect orchid. It was a rare Paphiopedilum rothschildianum, its petals a striking combination of burgundy and gold, vibrant and defiantly alive. There was no sender's name on the box, only a small, embossed card with a single, handwritten sentence. "Life persists." Chloe smiled, placing the orchid on her windowsill where the afternoon sun caught its petals. Far across the city, in a steel and glass office overlooking the urban sprawl, Kwon Jae-sung stood without a cane. His recovery was nearly complete. The experience had changed him, carving away a layer of ruthless ambition and replacing it with a quiet introspection. He had dismantled the more predatory aspects of his organization, redirecting his vast resources toward medical research and philanthropy. He looked down at the city, no longer a circuit board to be conquered, but a complex ecosystem of lives, each with its own story. He thought of the quiet girl who saw a dying plant and understood a universe of deceit. She had given him back his life, and in return, he had given her a chance to find her own. It was, he reflected, the most profitable transaction he had ever made.